The carriage wheels screamed against the cobblestones as Elena Voss ran through the rain, her chest burning, her hands shaking around the letter she had just stolen back from the fireplace before it burned completely. Behind her, the windows of Renwick Hall glowed gold, and somewhere inside that mansion, a wedding was being planned that was never supposed to happen. She had 3 days. 3 days to stop a man she barely trusted from marrying a woman he did not love. And somehow, in the middle of all of it, she had fallen for him herself. It began on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks earlier, when Elena had been sent to Renwick Hall to fit a gown that was not even meant for her. She was a seamstress, one of 6 girls working under Madame Fairfield, and her job that day was simple. Deliver the silk, take the measurements of Lady Cassandra Thorne, and leave before anyone noticed a servant girl had touched the future Duchess's wedding dress with her bare hands. Elena had done this kind of work 100 times. She knew how to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut. What she did not expect was to walk into the wrong hallway and come face to face with Duke Alastair Renwick himself, standing in the library with his shirt sleeves rolled up, arguing quietly with his estate manager about numbers that clearly troubled him. He looked up when she entered by mistake, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Elena expected him to call for a servant to remove her. Instead, he smiled, an easy, tired smile that did not match the coldness people whispered about him in town. "I am looking for the East Wing," she said, holding her basket of thread and pins like a shield. "You have found the West Wing instead," he said, "and it is significantly more boring here, so I understand your confusion." She should have laughed politely and left. Instead, she found herself smiling back before she could stop it. He walked her to the East Wing himself, past the portraits of his ancestors, past the marble staircase that seemed too grand for one family, and he talked the entire way, asking her questions no nobleman had ever asked a seamstress before. What she thought of the weather turning early this year, whether she enjoyed her work, whether she had ever wanted to leave the city and see the coast. Elena did not know it then, but that walk down one hallway would change the direction of her entire life. Over the following days, she returned to Renwick Hall more often than her work required. Sometimes there was a genuine reason, a hem that needed adjusting, a fitting that ran long. Other times, she simply found herself near the estate on her free afternoons, telling herself she only wanted to see the gardens, knowing that was not the whole truth. Alastair began finding reasons of his own. He would appear in the garden just as she arrived, claiming he needed air. He would linger near the servants' entrance, claiming he was checking on a delivery. Neither of them said what was happening, but both of them knew. The engagement to Lady Cassandra Thorne had been arranged 2 years earlier by their fathers, a business agreement wrapped in lace and flowers, meant to join 2 powerful families, and settle a debt that Alastair's father had left behind before he passed. Alastair had never pretended to love her. He had simply agreed to the marriage the way a man agrees to inherit a house he did not choose, because refusing was not something a duke was permitted to do without consequence. Elena knew all of this. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever was growing between her and Alastair could stay small and harmless, a friendship built in stolen half-hours that would end quietly once the wedding took place, and she returned to her ordinary life sewing dresses for other people's happiness. But feelings are not obedient things. They do not stay where you put them. It was on a rainy evening in the greenhouse behind Renwick Hall that everything changed. Elena had come to deliver a repaired veil, and she found Alastair sitting alone among the plants, staring at nothing, a glass of wine untouched beside him. He looked younger in that moment, less like a duke, and more like a man trapped inside a life he had never agreed to live. "You look like someone who is about to do something he regrets," she said, setting the veil down carefully. "I regret most things before I do them," he answered. "It has never stopped me yet." She sat across from him, close enough that the rain on the glass roof was the only sound between them. He told her things that night he had never told anyone, about his father's debts, about the marriage that would erase them, about the loneliness of being raised to inherit a title before he was ever allowed to be a child. Elena listened without judgment, and somewhere in that greenhouse, surrounded by wet leaves and candlelight, Alastair reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "I know what I am supposed to do," he said quietly. "I am supposed to marry a woman I respect, but do not love, secure my family's name, and spend the rest of my life pretending that is enough. And then you walked into the wrong hallway, and I stopped believing that was enough." Alina's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Everything about this was wrong. He belonged to another woman, at least on paper, and she belonged to no one, which was exactly why loving him felt like the most dangerous thing she had ever done. And yet she did not pull her hand away. "You cannot say things like that to me," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it is improper, or because you are afraid you might say something back?" She did not answer him with words. She answered him by staying, by letting the silence stretch long enough that it became its own kind of confession. From that night forward, their meetings became less accidental and more deliberate. Alastair began sending notes through a trusted footman, arranging times when the household staff would be occupied elsewhere. Alina knew every risk she was taking. If anyone discovered a seamstress meeting privately with the Duke while he was engaged to another woman, her reputation would be destroyed beyond repair, and his family name would suffer a scandal that could follow him for the rest of his life. Still, she kept going back. Lady Cassandra Thorne, meanwhile, remained mostly unaware, though not entirely blind. She had noticed Alastair's growing distance, the way he seemed to find reasons to avoid dinners with her family, the way his letters had grown shorter and colder over the past month. Cassandra was not a foolish woman. She simply chose, for the moment, to believe that his coldness was nerves about the wedding, rather than something else entirely. She had her own reasons for wanting the marriage to succeed, reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with securing her own family's failing finances. In that sense, she and Alastair were more alike than either of them realized. Two people trapped inside an arrangement neither of them had chosen. Alina tried more than once to end things before they went too far. She told herself she would stop visiting Renwick Hall, that she would let Alastair marry the woman he was promised to and disappear back into her old life of thread and fabric and quiet ambition. But every time she made that decision, a note would arrive, or she would see him waiting near the market where she bought her supplies, and her resolve would crumble all over again. One afternoon, Alastair asked her to meet him somewhere outside the estate for the first time, a small cottage near the edge of his family's land that had once belonged to a groundskeeper and now stood empty. It was there, surrounded by nothing but fields and silence, that he finally said the words that would change the course of everything that followed. "I do not want to marry Cassandra," he said. "I have tried to convince myself it does not matter who I marry, that duty is enough to build a life on. But I cannot stop thinking about you, Alina, not for one single day." She wanted to believe him completely, without hesitation, without fear. But some small, cautious part of her whispered a warning she did not yet understand, a feeling that a man who could so easily abandon one promise might one day abandon another. She pushed that feeling aside, telling herself it was only fear talking, only the voice of a girl who had never been allowed to hope for something this large. "I am afraid," she admitted, "not of what people will say about me. I am used to being invisible to people like you. I am afraid of becoming someone I do not recognize, someone who built her happiness on another woman's heartbreak." Alastair took her face gently in his hands, his eyes steady in a way that made her chest ache. "Then let us build something honest instead," he said. "Let me end the engagement properly. Let me tell Cassandra the truth, so no one is deceived, so nothing is stolen. I would rather face every scandal in London than spend one more year pretending to love a woman I do not, while the only person I actually love waits for me in secret." It was a beautiful promise, spoken with complete sincerity, and Alina believed every word of it. She did not yet know that promises made in empty cottages, away from the eyes of society and the weight of consequence, are sometimes easier to make than they are to keep. She did not yet know that the same charm that had drawn her toward him in the West Wing hallway had likely once drawn Cassandra Thorne toward him as well, before duty and coldness replaced whatever warmth might have existed between them. That night, walking back toward the city with the cottage disappearing behind her in the darkness, Alina allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future as Alastair's wife. She pictured herself standing beside him at Renwick Hall, no longer measuring hems for a wedding she was not invited to, but living inside the very halls where she had first lost her heart to him. She imagined it with the innocent certainty of someone who had never yet been given a reason not to trust him completely. She did not know that within days, the secret they had guarded so carefully would begin to unravel, that a single careless word from a servant would set into motion a scandal that would reach every drawing room in the city. She did not know that the woman she was about to humiliate without meaning to would one day become the only person who truly understood what she was walking into. And she certainly did not know that the man she believed she was falling in love with had a version of himself that he had never once shown her. A version that Cassandra Thorne had already met, and had already learned, quietly and painfully, to fear. All Alina knew, on that quiet walk home under a sky heavy with stars, was that she loved him, and that love at that moment felt like more than enough reason to risk everything she had. She was wrong, but she would not understand how wrong for a long time yet. The servant who saw them first was a young girl named Margaret, barely 16, who had been sent to the cottage to check for a lost hunting dog belonging to the Renwick family. She saw Alina and Alastair standing close together near the cottage door, saw his hand resting against her cheek, and though she said nothing at the time, she carried the image home with her like a coal burning quietly in her pocket. Servants talk, not out of malice most of the time, but because silence is a luxury only the wealthy can afford. Within 2 days, the story had traveled from the kitchen of Renwick Hall to the kitchen of the Thorne household, passed along in whispers between cooks and maids who did not fully understand what they were setting in motion. Lady Cassandra Thorne heard the rumor from her own lady's maid, a woman named Beatrice who had served her since childhood and would never have repeated something so serious without being certain it was true. Cassandra did not believe it at first. She sat very still in her chair by the window, her needlework forgotten in her lap, and told Beatrice to leave her alone for the rest of the evening. She spent that night the way a person spends a night when their entire life is quietly rearranging itself without their permission. She thought of every dinner where Alastair had seemed distracted, every letter that had grown shorter, every time he had found a reason to leave a room the moment she entered it. She had explained all of it away before, blaming his moods, his grief over his father, the pressure of managing an estate burdened with debt. Now, sitting alone with the truth pressing against her chest, she understood that she had simply chosen not to see what had been in front of her for months. Cassandra was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry that night either. Instead, she made a decision. She would not confront Alastair privately, where he could offer smooth explanations and empty apologies behind closed doors. She would confront him, and the woman he had chosen, in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most to both their families. If she was going to be humiliated, she decided, she would not be humiliated quietly. The opportunity came 3 days later, at a garden party hosted by Alastair's aunt, Lady Alina Renwick, meant to celebrate the approaching wedding. Alina had not been invited, of course. She had no reason to attend such an event, no status that would grant her entry into a garden filled with silk gowns and polished conversation. But Alastair, in a moment of reckless affection that he would later come to regret, had asked her to come anyway, disguised among the hired musicians as a favor to a friend, simply so he could see her for a few stolen minutes during the afternoon. It was a foolish decision, born from the kind of confidence that comes easily to men who have never truly faced consequences. Alina hesitated when he suggested it, some instinct warning her that nothing good could come from placing herself inside a celebration meant to honor another woman's wedding. But Alastair was persuasive, and she wanted, more than she wanted to admit, to see him in his own world, even from a distance, even hidden among strangers. The garden was full of laughter and music when Alina arrived, dressed simply, carrying a violin case that belonged to one of the musicians she had befriended through her work at Madame Fairfield's shop. She kept to the edges of the party, watching Alastair from across the lawn as he moved among his guests with practiced charm, playing the part of a devoted groom for an audience that had no idea how little of it was real. For a while it felt almost peaceful, watching him from a safe distance, imagining a future where she would not need to hide. Then Cassandra saw her. It was not difficult to recognize her, even from across the garden. Cassandra had memorized every detail Beatrice had described: the dark hair, the plain but well-made dress, the particular way she stood as though trying to take up as little space as possible. Cassandra set down her glass of lemonade with deliberate calm and began walking directly toward her, and something in her posture made the surrounding conversations fall quiet one by one, like candles being snuffed out along her path. "You must be the seamstress," Cassandra said, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn, loud enough that heads turned from every direction. "I have heard so much about you, more than I ever expected to hear about a woman hired to fit my wedding gown." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what words could possibly make this moment survivable. "I am sorry," she managed. "I did not mean to intrude on your celebration." "No," Cassandra said, stepping closer, her composure a thin shell over something far more dangerous underneath. "I imagine you did not mean for me to find out at all. That would have been far more convenient for you and my fiancé, wouldn't it? Sneaking around behind a woman's back is so much easier when she never learns the truth." By now, every guest in the garden had turned to watch. The musicians had stopped playing, and Alistair, hearing the commotion from across the lawn, was pushing his way through the crowd with growing horror on his face. He arrived just as Cassandra delivered the final blow, her voice steady and cutting in a way that would be repeated in drawing rooms across the city for weeks afterward. "Tell me," Cassandra said, turning to address the crowd rather than Elena directly, "is it customary now for a duke to conduct his affairs with the woman hired to sew his bride's wedding dress? I do hope you at least did excellent work on the hem, since it seems you spent so much time in this household." The crowd's reaction was immediate and cruel, the particular cruelty of polite society, expressed through gasps and whispered comments rather than shouting, but no less devastating for its quietness. Elena stood frozen, humiliation burning through her entire body, unable to defend herself in a setting where the rules of the game had always been designed to favor women like Cassandra over women like her. Alistair finally reached them, stepping between the two women with his hands raised, though it was already far too late to contain what had happened. "Cassandra," he said, his voice low and urgent, "this is not the place." "You are right," Cassandra answered, her composure cracking just slightly, revealing the hurt underneath the fury for the briefest moment before she pulled it back together. "This is not the place. The place would have been your study months ago when you first decided you did not want to marry me. Instead you let me plan a wedding, order a dress, invite 200 guests, all while carrying on with someone else entirely. Tell me, Alistair, was it ever going to stop, or was I simply meant to marry you and spend the rest of my life pretending not to notice?" The silence that followed was the kind that presses against the ears, heavy and complete. Alistair looked between Cassandra and Elena, and for a moment something shifted in his expression, a decision forming behind his eyes that would alter the direction of everyone's life standing in that garden. "You are right," he said finally, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "I should have ended this properly, months ago, rather than letting it come to this. I am sorry for the manner in which you have learned the truth, Cassandra. You deserved better than a garden party filled with strangers." "Then say it plainly," Cassandra said, her chin raised despite the tears now visible in her eyes. "Say what you actually mean, in front of everyone who is already watching us." Alistair took a breath, and Elena felt her heart pounding so violently she thought the entire garden must be able to hear it. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and vanish from a scene that was quickly becoming the most talked-about scandal London had seen in years. But she could not move, could not look away from the man whose next words would decide the shape of her entire future. "I cannot marry you, Cassandra," Alistair said. "Not because I do not respect you, but because I have fallen in love with someone else, and I refuse to build a marriage on a lie any longer than I already have." The gasps that followed were louder this time, rippling outward through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Cassandra stood perfectly still, absorbing the public destruction of her engagement with a dignity that would later be remembered far more kindly by society than the affair itself. She did not scream, did not weep openly, did not give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of watching her fall apart entirely. Instead, she simply nodded once, turned, and walked back into the house without another word, her spine straight despite the devastation clearly written across her face. The party ended in chaos after that. Guests departed in hushed clusters, already composing the versions of the story they would tell at their own dinner tables that night. Alistair's aunt, Lady Alina, stood pale and horrified near the refreshment table, understanding immediately the magnitude of what had just happened to the family's reputation. Alina stood alone near the edge of the garden, abandoned momentarily by Alistair as he attempted to manage the disaster unfolding around him. And in that solitude, she finally understood the true cost of what she had allowed herself to want. By the following morning, the story had spread across every corner of the city. Newspapers that covered society gossip printed careful, coded versions of the scandal, referring to an unnamed duke and a seamstress of questionable reputation, though everyone who mattered already knew the true names involved. Alina's employer, Madame Fairfield, dismissed her from the shop within the week, unwilling to have her business associated with such a public disgrace. Alina's few friends among the other seamstresses distanced themselves quickly, afraid that association with her would damage their own reputations. Even her landlady looked at her differently now, with a mixture of curiosity and judgment that made Alina feel as though she had become a spectacle rather than a person. Cassandra Thorne disappeared from public events almost entirely in the weeks that followed. Her family, humiliated by the very public collapse of an engagement that had been meant to secure their finances, retreated to their country estate, and society, ever hungry for its next subject, began to speak of the Thorne family with a mixture of pity and quiet cruelty. Cassandra herself said almost nothing to anyone outside her immediate family. What she felt and what she began quietly planning during those long weeks of isolation would not become clear to anyone, including Alina, for a long time yet. Through all of this, Alistair remained remarkably composed, a fact that Alina noticed but did not yet fully understand the meaning of. He did not seem troubled by the scandal in the way she expected a man to be troubled by publicly humiliating a woman he had once promised to marry. If anything, he seemed almost relieved, as though a weight he had carried reluctantly for years had finally been set down, regardless of the damage caused in the process of putting it aside. Within a month, Alistair had made his intentions toward Alina official, informing his family and what remained of his social circle that he intended to marry her, once a suitable amount of time had passed to allow the scandal to quiet. Alina, still reeling from the speed and violence of everything that had happened, found herself swept along by his certainty, unable to fully process her own feelings before the next decision was already being made around her. She should have paused in those weeks to ask herself harder questions. She should have wondered why a man capable of ending one engagement so publicly, so coldly, seemed so entirely undisturbed by the pain he had caused. She should have wondered what it meant that he had chosen a garden party, full of witnesses, rather than a private conversation, to reveal the truth to Cassandra, and whether that choice said more about his character than his declaration of love had revealed. Instead, caught in the exhausting momentum of scandal and sudden hope, Alina allowed herself to believe that the worst part was already behind her. She believed that once the wedding took place, once she officially became the Duchess of Renwick, the whispers would fade, the newspapers would move on to some other scandal, and she and Alistair would finally be free to build the life he had promised her in that quiet, rain-soaked greenhouse weeks before. She did not yet understand that she had not survived the hardest part of this story. She had only survived the beginning of it. The wedding took place on a cold morning in early winter, 6 months after the scandal at the garden party had first broken across the city. It was a smaller affair than the one originally planned for Cassandra, held quietly at Renwick Hall with only a handful of guests in attendance, most of them Alistair's distant relatives who felt obligated to appear despite their private disapproval. Alina wore a simple gown of pale blue, nothing like the elaborate dress that had once been designed for another woman entirely. And as she walked down the aisle toward Alistair, she told herself firmly that this quiet, imperfect beginning was still a beginning worth having. Alistair looked handsome in his dark coat, his expression calm and steady as she approached, and when he took her hand at the altar, Alina felt a rush of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. They had survived the worst of it, she believed. The scandal, the whispers, the loss of her position at Madame Fairfield's shop, all of it had led to this single moment, and surely now, finally, they could begin the life they had both wanted so badly. The first weeks of the marriage passed in a kind of dazed happiness. Alina moved into Renwick Hall properly for the first time, no longer sneaking through servants' entrances or hiding in greenhouses, but walking freely through halls that now belonged to her as much as they belonged to Alistair. The household staff addressed her as Duchess, a title that still felt strange and enormous every time someone used it, and though she caught occasional glances of curiosity or judgment from the older servants who remembered the scandal clearly, she told herself that time would soften even that discomfort eventually. Alistair was attentive during those early weeks, taking her on walks through the estate grounds, showing her rooms of the house she had never seen during her visits as a seamstress, telling her stories about his childhood that revealed a softer, more vulnerable side of himself than she had glimpsed before. There were evenings when he read to her by the fire, and mornings when he surprised her with small gifts, and Alina allowed herself, cautiously at first and then with growing confidence, to believe that they had truly built something real out of the wreckage of that terrible garden party. The first sign that something was wrong came so small and quiet that Alina almost did not notice it at all. It happened nearly 2 months into the marriage, during a dinner with several of Alistair's business associates, men whose approval mattered greatly to the financial recovery of the Renwick estate. Alina, still unfamiliar with the particular customs and expectations of noble dinner conversation, made a comment about a recent trade agreement that she had misunderstood slightly, an innocent mistake born from inexperience rather than carelessness. One of the guests laughed, not unkindly, and corrected her gently, and the conversation moved on within moments. But later that night, once the guests had departed and the servants had cleared the dining room, Alistair's expression changed the moment the door closed behind the last visitor. The warmth he had shown all evening evaporated so quickly and completely that Alina felt as though she were suddenly standing in front of an entirely different man. "Do you understand what you did tonight?" he asked, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more frightening than shouting would have been. "I made a small mistake," Alina said, confused by the sudden shift in his mood. "I did not mean any harm by it." "A small mistake," he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her stomach tighten with unease. "Those men control contracts that could save or destroy this family's finances. I spent years building relationships with them, years repairing the damage my father left behind, and you undid part of that in a single careless sentence because you could not be bothered to learn the difference between a trade agreement and a simple loan." Alina tried to explain, tried to remind him that she had grown up sewing dresses, not studying finance, that no one had ever taught her the details of noble business dealings, that she was still learning the customs of a world she had entered so suddenly and so completely. But Alistair did not seem to hear any of it. He spoke over her explanations, his voice growing sharper and colder with every sentence, until Alina found herself standing silently, absorbing words that felt less like correction and more like punishment. "You are the Duchess of Renwick now," he said finally, his tone flat and final. "It is time you started acting like it, rather than the seamstress you used to be." He left the room without waiting for her response, and Alina stood alone in the empty dining hall, her hands trembling slightly, trying to understand what had just happened. She told herself in the days that followed that he had simply been stressed, worried about the family finances, exhausted from the burden of managing an estate that had never fully recovered from his father's debts. She told herself that every marriage had difficult moments, that she was still adjusting to a life so different from anything she had known before, and that patience, on both their parts, would smooth these rough edges eventually. But the pattern, once it had begun, did not fade. It repeated itself again during a dinner 3 weeks later, when Alina wore a dress Alistair considered too plain for the occasion. It repeated itself when she spent an afternoon with one of the few servants who had shown her kindness since her arrival, a young maid named Grace, and Alistair informed her afterward, with quiet disapproval, that a duchess did not befriend the household staff so casually. It repeated itself when she expressed an opinion during a discussion about renovating part of the estate, an opinion Alistair dismissed so thoroughly and so coldly that Alina stopped offering opinions in front of him at all. Each incident, taken on its own, seemed small enough to excuse. Alina found herself becoming skilled at explaining away each individual moment, telling herself that he was tired, that he was under pressure, that this particular disagreement was simply a misunderstanding rather than a pattern. It was only in the quiet moments alone, lying awake at night while Alistair slept undisturbed beside her, that she allowed herself to notice how much smaller she had become since the wedding, how carefully she now weighed every word before speaking, how rarely she laughed freely anymore compared to those stolen afternoons in the greenhouse, when everything between them had still felt like possibility rather than obligation. Grace, the young maid Alistair had discouraged her from befriending, became one of the few people Alina still trusted inside the walls of Renwick Hall. Grace was careful, always speaking quietly, always glancing toward the door before sharing anything too honest. But over the following weeks, small pieces of information began to reach Alina through her, pieces that painted a picture very different from the one Alistair had shown her during their courtship. "He was different before you arrived too," Grace admitted one afternoon while helping Alina with her hair in the privacy of her chambers. "Colder, I mean. Not always. But there were days, especially after his father passed, when the staff learned to stay out of his way entirely. Some of the older servants say Lady Cassandra endured quite a lot in the 2 years of their engagement, though she never spoke of it publicly. She was very good at hiding things, that one." Alina felt a chill move through her at those words, though she was not yet ready to fully understand their meaning. She had assumed, without ever truly questioning it, that Alistair's coldness toward Cassandra had been simple indifference, the natural result of an arranged marriage between two people who had never chosen each other. She had assumed that whatever warmth he now showed her, however inconsistently, proved that their relationship was fundamentally different, built on genuine feeling rather than obligation. But Grace's words planted a small seed of doubt that Alina found herself unable to fully uproot. No matter how many times she told herself, she was simply imagining connections that did not exist. The isolation grew gradually, so gradually that Alina barely noticed it happening until it was nearly complete. Alistair began finding reasons why she should not attend certain social gatherings, explaining that her reputation was still too fragile after the scandal, that appearing too soon in public would only invite further gossip and damage the family name further. He discouraged her correspondence with the few friends she had maintained from her days as a seamstress, suggesting gently at first, and then more firmly, that such friendships were beneath her new station, and would only remind society of a past she should be trying to leave behind. Alina, still believing that his concerns came from a place of protection rather than control, found herself agreeing to each restriction, one small compromise at a time, until she looked up one day and realized that her entire world had shrunk to the walls of Renwick Hall and the moods of the man who ruled inside them. The cruelty, when it came, rarely arrived as shouting or physical harshness. It arrived instead in cold silences that could stretch for days after a minor disagreement, in comments delivered so precisely that they left invisible bruises far deeper than any visible mark could have caused, in the particular way Alistair had of making Alina feel, again and again, that she was fortunate he had chosen her at all, given where she had come from and what she had once been. "You were nothing before this marriage," he told her once, during an argument about whether she could visit her ailing mother in the city without his accompaniment. A seamstress with no family name, no fortune, no prospects beyond stitching hems for women wealthier than yourself. I gave you all of this. The least you could do is show some gratitude, rather than constantly testing the limits of what I am willing to allow. Alina did not argue. She had learned by then that arguing only extended the cold silences that followed, silences that could last for a week or more, during which Alistair would speak to her only when absolutely necessary, treating her like a stranger inside her own home. She had learned to apologize quickly, to smooth things over before they escalated, to make herself smaller and quieter in ways that felt, on her worst nights, uncomfortably familiar to something she could not quite name. It was during one of these long, cold silences, nearly 4 months into the marriage, that Alina found herself standing alone in the same greenhouse where Alistair had once held her hand and spoken of building an honest life together. The plants had grown wilder since that night, less carefully tended, much like the promises he had made her there. She stood among them, remembering the warmth of his hand, the sincerity in his voice, and wondered with a growing sense of dread whether that man had ever truly existed, or whether he had simply been a version of Alistair crafted specifically to win something he wanted, discarded now that the winning was complete. She thought of Cassandra Thorne then, for the first time in months, wondering what the other woman had truly endured during those 2 years of engagement, wondering whether the humiliation at the garden party had been, in some strange and terrible way, closer to a rescue than a tragedy. The thought frightened her, not because it seemed unlikely, but because some quiet, honest part of her was beginning to suspect it might be true. That night, unable to sleep, Alina rose quietly from the bed she shared with her husband and walked to the small writing desk near the window of her chambers. She took out a sheet of paper and, for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself, began writing down everything she could remember, every cold silence, every dismissed opinion. Every comment about her past delivered like a weapon rather than an observation. She did not yet know why she felt compelled to document these things, only that some instinct, buried deep beneath the confusion and hope she still clung to, told her that she might need this record someday, that the truth of her life inside Renwick Hall deserved to exist somewhere beyond her own uncertain memory. She folded the paper carefully and hid it beneath a loose floorboard near her writing desk. A small act of quiet rebellion that felt, in that moment, like the only power she had left. Outside, the wind moved through the estate grounds, rattling the greenhouse glass where 2 lovers had once made promises neither of them had fully understood the weight of. And inside the great house, Alina Voss, now Duchess of Renwick, lay awake long into the night, beginning, without yet realizing it, the slow and careful process of understanding exactly what she had married into. Winter deepened over the following weeks, and so did the distance between Alina and the man she had married. What had once felt like occasional storms in an otherwise calm household began to feel more like the permanent climate of her life. Alistair's moods grew less predictable, his patience thinner, and Alina found herself constantly recalculating, moment to moment, which version of him she might encounter behind any given door. Sometimes he was charming, attentive, almost the man from the greenhouse again, bringing her small gifts and speaking warmly of their future. Other times, without any warning she could identify, his expression would shift, his voice would flatten, and the walls of Renwick Hall would seem to grow colder around her. Grace remained one of the only steady presences in Alina's life during this time, though even their friendship had to exist carefully, in stolen moments when Alistair was occupied elsewhere. It was Grace who first mentioned, hesitantly and with visible reluctance, a name Alina had not expected to hear again. "There is a woman who sometimes visits the housekeeper," Grace said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper as she helped Alina arrange fresh flowers in the sitting room. "She used to work here years ago, before your time and before Lady Cassandra as well. Her name is Charlotte. She left this house in a hurry, and there are those among the older staff who remember why, though none of them speak of it openly." Alina felt a familiar unease settle over her, the same feeling she had experienced weeks earlier when Grace first mentioned Cassandra's difficult years of engagement. She asked Grace to continue, though some cautious part of her already suspected she might not want to hear what came next. Charlotte was close to the Duke. Before his father passed, Grace explained carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the danger of gossip inside these walls. Closer than a servant should be, if you understand my meaning. And then, quite suddenly, she was gone. No explanation given to the rest of us. Just gone one morning with her belongings packed and a look on her face I have never forgotten. Alina did not sleep well that night, turning Grace's words over and over in her mind, searching for some explanation that did not point toward the conclusion slowly forming at the edges of her thoughts. She told herself that every great house carried old stories, old scandals, old servants who left under circumstances no one fully understood. She told herself that Charlotte's departure, whatever its cause, had nothing to do with her own marriage, her own increasingly uncertain future inside these same walls. But the doubt, once planted, refused to be uprooted so easily. 3 days later, Alina found herself in the estate's private library, searching for a book to occupy her mind during another of Alistair's long absences, when she came across a small, unremarkable box tucked behind a row of ledgers on a high shelf. She should not have opened it. She understood, even as her fingers reached toward the lid, that whatever waited inside had been deliberately hidden, and that finding it uninvited was a violation she could not easily undo. But something in her, some instinct sharpened by months of quiet unease, told her that she needed to know. Inside the box she found letters, dozens of them tied together with faded ribbon, written in a hand she did not recognize. She opened the first one carefully, and as she read, her hands began to tremble. The letters were from Charlotte, written across a span of nearly a year, and they told a story achingly similar to Alina's own. Early letters spoke of affection, of promises made in private, of a young Alistair, still grieving his father, finding comfort in Charlotte's presence during a difficult time. But as the letters progressed, their tone shifted, growing increasingly desperate, increasingly frightened. Charlotte wrote of Alistair's growing coldness, his controlling demands, the way he isolated her from the rest of the household staff, the way small mistakes brought punishments that had nothing to do with the affection he had once promised her. The final letter, dated nearly 2 years before Alina had ever set foot in Renwick Hall, was short, its handwriting unsteady, and it spoke only of leaving, of never returning, of finally understanding that whatever Alistair had offered her at the beginning had never been real in the way she needed it to be. Alina sat on the library floor for a long time after reading the final letter, the pieces of a pattern she had been refusing to see finally arranging themselves into something impossible to ignore. Charlotte, Cassandra, and now herself. 3 women across several years, each drawn in by the same warmth, the same careful attention, the same promises of an honest life together, only to discover, once the promises had served their purpose, a coldness underneath that seemed to grow crueler each time it was allowed to surface unchecked. She returned the letters carefully to their box and replaced everything exactly as she had found it, her mind racing with questions she was not yet ready to answer. Had Alistair truly loved any of them, even for a moment, or had each relationship simply been a means of escaping something else? A marriage he did not want, a loneliness he refused to properly face, a father's memory he had never fully processed. Had she been chosen for herself at all, or had she simply been convenient, present at the right moment, willing to believe in a version of him that made leaving Cassandra easier to justify? The questions followed her for days afterward, coloring every interaction with Alistair in a new and troubling light. She began watching him more carefully, noticing details she had previously excused or overlooked entirely. The way his warmth seemed to increase whenever he wanted something from her, a public appearance to repair his reputation, a quiet evening that made him look devoted in front of visiting guests, and how quickly that warmth cooled once the desired outcome had been achieved. The way his anger, though never physical, carried an edge of genuine enjoyment sometimes, a satisfaction in watching her flinch, in watching her apologize, in watching her grow smaller in his presence. She thought often, during those difficult weeks, of the garden party where their relationship had first become public, of the calm, almost satisfied way Alistair had delivered his final blow to Cassandra in front of the assembled crowd. At the time, she had interpreted his composure as strength, as the confidence of a man finally choosing honesty over obligation. Now, armed with the knowledge of Charlotte's letters, she began to wonder whether that composure had actually been something closer to enjoyment. A man who found a particular satisfaction in publicly discarding the women who had once trusted him. The turning point came on an evening in late winter, during an argument that started over something so small Alina could barely remember its origin days later. A comment she had made about wanting to visit the city more often, to reconnect with the small remaining circle of friends from her life before the marriage. Alistair's response was swift and cold, a lecture about propriety, about the ongoing damage the scandal had caused to the family name, about how her constant desire to return to her old life suggested an ingratitude he found deeply disappointing. Alina, exhausted from months of careful silence, finally allowed herself to push back, just slightly, just enough to ask the question that had been building inside her for weeks. Was Cassandra as ungrateful as I am, she asked quietly, or Charlotte before her? Did they disappoint you the same way before you decided you no longer wanted them either? The reaction on Alistair's face was immediate and unmistakable, a flash of something cold and dangerous that Alina had not seen directed at her so nakedly before. For a moment she thought he might raise his voice, might finally reveal the full force of whatever anger simmered beneath his controlled exterior. Instead, his voice dropped even lower, quieter, somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. You have been going through things that do not belong to you, he said, each word measured and precise. I suggest you remember your place in this house, Alina, before you find yourself as forgotten as the women you seem so eager to discuss. He left the room without another word, and Alina stood alone, her heart pounding, finally understanding with complete clarity something she had been trying desperately to avoid facing for months. She was not the exception to a pattern of behavior Alistair had shown other women before her. She was simply the current chapter in a story that had already been written and rewritten more times than she had known. A story that seemed to end, every time, with a woman discarded, isolated, or forced to flee before her spirit was completely worn away. That night, once the house had settled into silence, and she was certain Alistair had retreated to his own chambers rather than hers, Alina retrieved the folded paper hidden beneath the loose floorboard near her writing desk and added new pages to her growing record. She wrote down every detail she could remember about Charlotte's letters, about Grace's careful warnings, about the particular coldness in Alistair's eyes when she had dared to ask about the women who came before her. She did not yet know exactly what she intended to do with this record, only that it felt increasingly important to preserve the truth, somewhere Alistair could not erase or reshape it to suit his own version of events. Somewhere beneath the fear and confusion that had come to define so much of her daily life at Renwick Hall, a new feeling began to take root inside Alina, quiet and unfamiliar at first, but growing steadier with each passing day. It was not yet courage, not fully, but it was something close to its beginning. A refusal to simply accept the diminished, careful version of herself that Alistair seemed determined to shape her into. A growing certainty that whatever happened next, she would not disappear as quietly as Charlotte apparently had, and she would not suffer in silence the way Cassandra had endured for 2 long years before finally being publicly humiliated rather than gently released. She thought again of Cassandra, standing tall and composed in that garden months ago, delivering her devastating words in front of the entire assembled crowd rather than crumbling privately in shame. At the time, Alina had felt only guilt watching that confrontation, aware that her own choices had contributed to another woman's public heartbreak. Now, with new understanding of what Cassandra might have actually endured during those 2 years of engagement, that guilt began transforming into something else entirely, a strange and unexpected kinship with a woman she had once considered her rival. Alina did not yet know how to reach Cassandra, or whether such a meeting would even be welcomed given everything that had happened between them. But as winter began giving way to the first uncertain signs of spring outside the estate windows, she found herself thinking more and more about the possibility, turning the idea over carefully in her mind during the long, cold silences Alistair now imposed on her with increasing frequency. Somewhere in the city, a woman existed who understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, exactly what Alina was beginning to face inside the walls of Renwick Hall. And Alina, for the first time since her wedding day, began to seriously consider the possibility of seeking her out. Finding Cassandra Thorne proved more difficult than Alina had anticipated. The Thorne family had withdrawn almost entirely from society after the scandal, retreating to their country estate several hours outside the city, and the few acquaintances Alina still maintained from her old life knew little about their current circumstances beyond vague rumors and second-hand gossip. It took nearly 3 weeks of careful, quiet inquiry, conducted during the brief windows of freedom Alistair allowed her, before Alina finally learned that Cassandra had returned to the city recently, taking up modest lodgings near the eastern part of town rather than remaining isolated at her family's estate. Alina wrote to her twice before working up the courage to send either letter. The first attempt felt too formal, too distant, as though she were writing to a stranger rather than a woman whose life she had once shattered in a single afternoon. The second attempt felt too apologetic, too focused on Alina's own guilt rather than any genuine desire to understand what Cassandra had actually experienced. In the end, she wrote a third letter, shorter than the others, simply asking whether Cassandra might be willing to meet, without explanation, without excuses, only a request and an address where a response could reach her through Grace, who had agreed nervously to serve as a discreet intermediary. The response came 4 days later, a single line in Cassandra's precise handwriting. Tuesday afternoon, the tea house on Hollow Street, come alone. Alina spent the days leading up to the meeting in a state of nervous anticipation she had not experienced since her earliest days of secretly visiting Alistair at Renwick Hall, though the feeling now carried an entirely different weight. She was not anticipating romance or excitement this time, but something closer to reckoning, a confrontation she had been avoiding for months disguised as a simple conversation between two women whose lives had become permanently entangled through no real choice of their own. The tea house on Hollow Street was modest, tucked between a bookshop and a tailor's storefront, the kind of establishment that attracted working women and quiet conversations rather than the fashionable society Alina had once glimpsed from the edges of that fateful garden party. Cassandra was already seated when Alina arrived, wearing simple clothing that bore no resemblance to the elaborate gowns Alina remembered from months earlier, her hair pulled back plainly, her expression unreadable as Alina approached the small table near the window. "Sit down," Cassandra said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "You look nervous. I promise I am not planning to embarrass you the way I embarrassed you at that garden party, if that is what you are worried about." Alina sat carefully, unsure how to begin a conversation she had rehearsed dozens of times in her mind without ever settling on the right words. Cassandra studied her for a long moment, her expression shifting slightly, something like understanding passing briefly across her features before she spoke again. "You look different than I remember," Cassandra said. "Thinner, perhaps, and there is something in your eyes I recognize very well." "I need to ask you something," Alina said, deciding finally to abandon her rehearsed opening entirely and simply speak honestly. "About Alistair. About what your engagement was actually like, before everything happened at that garden party." Cassandra's expression did not change, though something in the way she set down her teacup suggested the question had struck somewhere deep, somewhere she had perhaps expected this conversation to eventually reach, even if she had not admitted it to herself before this moment. "Why do you want to know now?" Cassandra asked. "Months after you married him, months after you took everything I was supposed to have." "I did not take anything from you that you wanted to keep," Alina said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I understand that now. I did not understand it then, not fully. I thought I was falling in love with a man who wanted an honest life with me instead of an obligation with you. I did not understand what I was actually walking into. Something shifted in Cassandra's posture then, the careful composure she had maintained since Alina's arrival softening slightly, revealing a tiredness underneath that had clearly been building for a long time before this conversation. 2 years, Cassandra said finally, her voice quieter than before. 2 years I spent engaged to that man, and in that time I learned exactly what kind of person hides beneath all that charm he shows the world so easily. He was not always cold, not at the beginning. There were moments early on when I believed I might actually grow to love him, when he seemed capable of real warmth and genuine kindness. But it never lasted. It was always followed by something colder, something that made me feel smaller every time I made even the slightest mistake in his eyes. Alina listened, her chest tightening with each word, recognizing patterns in Cassandra's account that mirrored her own experience with painful precision. Cassandra spoke of long silences that could stretch for days after minor disagreements, of comments about her family's financial troubles delivered like weapons rather than observations, of a growing isolation from her own friends and family that Alistair had encouraged gradually, always disguised as protection or concern for her reputation. I used to think it was my fault, Cassandra continued, staring down at her tea rather than meeting Alina's eyes. I thought if I simply tried harder, behaved better, understood him more patiently, the coldness would fade and the warmth from the beginning would return permanently. I spent 2 years trying to earn back something that I eventually realized had never truly existed in the way I believed it did. He was not capable of sustaining real affection, not for longer than it took to achieve whatever he wanted at that particular moment. I understand that now, though it took me far too long to accept it. Alina hesitated before speaking again, unsure whether the next question would cause more pain than clarity, but needing to ask it regardless. Did he ever mention someone named Charlotte? She asked carefully. Cassandra's eyes lifted sharply at the name, surprise flickering across her expression before settling into something more resigned. Not to me directly, she said, but I heard whispers, the same way you likely did, from servants who remembered things they were not supposed to discuss openly. A woman who worked in the household before my engagement began, who left suddenly and never returned. I always suspected there was more to that story than anyone was willing to share with me directly, but I never learned the full truth of what happened between them. I found letters, Alina said quietly, hidden in the library in a box behind some old ledgers. She wrote about the same things you just described. The early warmth, followed by growing coldness, followed eventually by isolation and fear. She left before things could get any worse, it seems. I do not know exactly what drove her to finally leave, but the pattern in her letters was unmistakable. The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of this shared understanding settling over the small table between them, transforming the nature of their meeting from a cautious reconciliation into something closer, to an alliance neither of them had fully anticipated when the conversation began. I used to hate you, Cassandra admitted eventually, her voice softer now, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried when Alina first arrived. Not because you fell in love with him, but because I believed, for a long time, that you had somehow succeeded where I had failed, that whatever was broken in him simply did not apply to you the way it had applied to me. It was easier to believe that than to accept that the problem had never truly been mine at all, that it belonged entirely to him. I understand that feeling better than you might expect, Alina said, because I believed the same thing about you, in reverse. I believed that whatever coldness he showed you must have been the natural result of an arranged marriage neither of you chose, and that the warmth he showed me proved something different was possible between us. I did not want to consider that I might simply be next in a line of women who believed exactly what I believed, right up until the moment they finally understood the truth. Cassandra studied her for a long moment, something calculating entering her expression that had not been present earlier in their conversation, a sharpness that suggested she was beginning to consider possibilities beyond simple emotional reconciliation. What do you intend to do now? Cassandra asked. Now that you understand what you are actually married to. Alina hesitated, aware that this question required an honesty she had not yet fully allowed herself, even in the privacy of her own thoughts during the long nights spent hiding pages beneath her floorboard. I do not know exactly, she admitted. I have been keeping a record of everything he has done since our wedding. The silences, the comments, the isolation. I do not know yet what purpose it will serve, only that I felt compelled to preserve the truth somewhere he could not reshape it. I suppose part of me hoped that simply understanding the pattern might eventually show me a way out of it, though I have not yet found that path clearly. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower, though there was no one nearby to overhear their conversation in the quiet tea house. I kept records too, she said, during our engagement. I did not fully understand why at the time, only that some instinct told me I might need proof someday of what our relationship actually involved, beyond whatever polished version he presented to society. I have letters he wrote me, early in our engagement, that reveal far more about his true character than he likely realizes, along with detailed accounts of specific incidents I documented as they happened, much like it sounds as though you have been doing yourself. Alina felt something shift inside her chest at these words, a possibility beginning to form that she had not previously considered, a path forward that involved not simply enduring or eventually escaping her situation privately, but confronting it directly, with evidence and allies who understood exactly what she had survived and continued to survive within the walls of Renwick Hall. There is something else you should know, Cassandra continued, her expression growing more serious. Something I only recently discovered myself, through a source I trust completely within the household staff who remained loyal to me even after everything happened. Alistair has not been entirely faithful during your marriage either, Alina. There is a woman, someone he has been meeting privately for the past several months, someone whose existence he has kept carefully hidden from you the same way he once hid you from me. The revelation landed like a physical blow, though Alina found herself surprised by how quickly the initial shock settled into something closer to grim confirmation rather than genuine devastation. Some part of her, she realized, had been expecting exactly this kind of discovery for weeks now, had perhaps even anticipated it since the moment she found Charlotte's letters hidden in that library box. Of course he has, Alina said quietly, more to herself than to Cassandra, because that is simply what he does, isn't it? Find someone new to charm, someone new to promise an honest life, right up until the moment that promise becomes inconvenient or fully realized. Cassandra nodded slowly, watching Alina's reaction with something that might have been sympathy, or might have simply been recognition of a pain she herself understood intimately. I do not say this to hurt you further, Cassandra said. I say it because I believe together we finally have enough evidence to expose exactly what kind of man he actually is, in a way that neither of us could have accomplished separately. My letters and documentation from our engagement, your records from your marriage, evidence of his current infidelity, which I can help you gather with the assistance of staff members still loyal to me. If we combine everything carefully, at the right moment, in front of the right audience, we could ensure that society finally sees him clearly, rather than continuing to accept whatever polished version of himself he presents publicly. Alina sat quietly for a long moment, considering the magnitude of what Cassandra was proposing, aware that such a plan carried enormous risk for both of them, that exposing Alistair publicly could result in consequences neither woman could fully predict or control. But beneath the fear, she felt something else stirring, something that had been building slowly since she first found Charlotte's letters hidden in that library box, something that felt, for the first time in months, remarkably close to hope. I am willing to try, Alina said finally, meeting Cassandra's eyes steadily across the small table. I am tired of being afraid inside my own home. I am tired of watching every word I speak, every opinion I offer, waiting to see which version of him will respond. If there is a way to finally end this, to protect whatever woman he has turned his attention toward now, and any woman who might come after her, I want to be part of making that happen. Cassandra smiled then, the first genuine smile Alina had seen from her since their reunion began, a small but unmistakable expression of something like relief passing across her features. "Then we begin planning immediately," she said. "Carefully, patiently, because a man like Alistair will not be defeated by anger alone. He will only be defeated by evidence he cannot deny and an audience he cannot control. We have both learned that lesson already, at great personal cost. It is time we used what we learned to ensure he finally faces consequences for the pattern he has repeated for far too long." The two women spent the remainder of that afternoon deep in careful conversation, exchanging details, comparing timelines, beginning to construct the outline of a plan that would require patience, discretion, and courage from both of them in the weeks ahead. When Alina finally rose to leave, the winter light outside the tea-house window had already begun fading toward evening, and she walked back toward Renwick Hall with a steadiness in her steps that had been absent for months, carrying with her, for the first time since her wedding day, a genuine sense that her future was not entirely beyond her own control after all. The weeks that followed the meeting at the tea-house transformed Alina's daily life, inside Renwick Hall in ways that were invisible to anyone observing from the outside, yet profound in their effect on how she moved through each day. Where once she had simply endured Alistair's shifting moods, absorbing each cold silence or sharp comment with quiet resignation, she now began watching him with a different kind of attention entirely, cataloging details with the careful precision of someone building a case rather than simply surviving a marriage. Grace remained her closest ally within the household, though Alina was careful never to reveal the full scope of what she and Cassandra were now planning together, understanding that the fewer people who knew the details, the safer everyone involved would remain until the right moment arrived. Still, Grace proved invaluable in smaller ways, alerting Alina to Alistair's schedule, mentioning offhand comments from other servants that occasionally revealed useful fragments of information, and covering for Alina's occasional absences from the estate without asking too many questions about where those absences led. Cassandra, meanwhile, worked to identify the woman Alistair had been secretly meeting, relying on the household staff, who had remained loyal to her even after the scandal had driven her family from the city. It took nearly 3 weeks of careful, patient investigation before a name finally emerged, delivered to Alina through a note passed discreetly by Grace during an otherwise ordinary afternoon. The woman's name was Margaret Whitfield, a widow of modest means who lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, a woman Alistair had apparently met through a business associate several months earlier, shortly after his marriage to Alina had settled into its familiar pattern of coldness and control. According to the information Cassandra had gathered, Alistair visited Margaret regularly under the guise of business meetings, always careful to maintain a schedule that avoided suspicion, always generous with small gifts and promises that mirrored, with uncomfortable precision, the very same promises he had once made to Alina in that rain-soaked greenhouse. Learning Margaret's identity brought Alina a complicated mixture of emotions she had not fully anticipated. There was anger, certainly, sharp and immediate, directed at Alistair for repeating a pattern that had already destroyed one engagement and damaged her own marriage beyond repair. But there was also something closer to sorrow, an awareness that Margaret Whitfield, whoever she truly was, likely believed herself to be experiencing something genuine and rare, the same way Alina had once believed it herself during those early weeks of secret meetings and whispered promises. "I do not want to hurt her the way I was hurt," Alina told Cassandra during one of their now regular meetings at the tea-house on Hollow Street, both women speaking in low voices despite the privacy of their corner table. "Whatever plan we build, I want her to understand the truth gently, if possible. Not humiliated publicly the way I humiliated you, without meaning to." Cassandra considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "That is fair," she said, "and it is different from how things unfolded between us, though I understand now that neither of us truly chose the manner in which the truth came out that day. Perhaps we can find her privately first, before any public confrontation takes place, and give her the chance to remove herself from the situation before Alistair's reputation collapses around all three of us. They agreed, that afternoon, to approach Margaret directly rather than allowing her to become collateral damage in whatever confrontation eventually took place. It was a decision that revealed, more clearly than almost anything else in those difficult months, how far both women had grown from the bitter rivals who had once faced each other across a scandalized garden party, how completely their shared understanding of Alistair's true character had transformed them from adversaries into something closer to allies bound by painful, common experience. Meanwhile, inside Renwick Hall, Alina continued documenting everything she observed, adding pages regularly to the growing collection hidden beneath her floorboard. She recorded the precise dates and details of Alistair's supposed business meetings, cross-referencing them against the schedule Cassandra's sources had provided regarding his visits to Margaret Whitfield. She recorded specific comments he made during their remaining interactions, comments that revealed, with increasing clarity, the particular cruelty he seemed to reserve specifically for moments when he felt most secure in his control over her. "You have grown quieter lately," Alistair observed one evening, during a rare dinner they shared alone together, his eyes studying her with something that might have been suspicion, or might simply have been the idle curiosity of a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his household. "I am not certain whether I prefer this version of you, or the version who used to argue with me constantly during our first months of marriage. I have simply learned my place, as you once suggested I should," Alina answered carefully, keeping her voice level despite the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. Alistair studied her for a long moment, something calculating in his expression that made Alina's pulse quicken with unease, a fear that perhaps he had begun sensing the shift in her behavior, the careful distance she now maintained even during their most ordinary interactions. "Good," he said finally, returning his attention to his meal. "It suits you far better than the argumentative version who arrived here nearly a year ago now." Alina said nothing further, though the exchange left her shaken for hours afterward, a reminder of exactly how precarious her position remained inside this house, how easily Alistair could still make her feel small and powerless with only a handful of carefully chosen words. She understood in moments like these precisely why it had taken Cassandra 2 full years to finally break free from his influence, why Charlotte had apparently fled in the middle of the night rather than confronting him directly. The particular kind of control Alistair exercised was not built on obvious cruelty that could be easily named and resisted, but on a slow, patient erosion of confidence and self-worth that left its victims doubting their own perceptions long after the damage had already been done. It was during this period, as Alina's documentation grew more extensive and her secret partnership with Cassandra deepened, that she came dangerously close to being discovered. She had arranged to meet Cassandra one afternoon at the tea house, using her now familiar excuse of visiting the market for household supplies, when Alistair returned to Renwick Hall earlier than expected, his business meeting having concluded ahead of schedule. Grace, thinking quickly, informed him that Alina had gone into the city for fabric to repair some curtains in the East Wing, a plausible enough excuse given her background as a seamstress, though it left little room for the extended absence Alina's meeting actually required. By the time Alina returned to the estate, nearly 3 hours after her supposed errand should have concluded, she found Alistair waiting for her in the entrance hall, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. "You were gone longer than expected," he said, his tone deceptively casual as he studied her face for any sign of deception. "The fabric I wanted was not available at the first shop I visited," Alina answered, keeping her voice as steady as possible despite the fear tightening in her chest. "I had to search several establishments before finding an appropriate match for the curtains." Alistair's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, and Alina forced herself to meet his gaze directly, understanding instinctively that any hint of nervousness or evasion would only deepen his suspicion. Finally, he nodded slightly, though something in his expression suggested the explanation had not entirely satisfied him. "I trust you are not spending your afternoon with anyone inappropriate," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made the casual phrasing feel far more threatening than its words alone suggested. "You understand, of course, how quickly rumors can spread in this city, and how little patience I have remaining for further scandal attached to this family's name." "Of course," Elena said, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear pulsing through her entire body. "I understand completely." He studied her for a moment longer before finally turning and walking toward his study, leaving Elena standing alone in the entrance hall, her heart pounding so violently she thought he must surely have heard it during their exchange. She waited until she was certain he had fully retreated into his study before allowing herself to release the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling slightly as she made her way up to her chambers. That evening, once the house had settled into its usual nighttime silence, Elena retrieved her hidden pages and added a detailed account of the encounter, understanding with growing urgency that her window for gathering evidence and building their plan safely was likely narrower than she had previously believed. If Alastair's suspicion continued growing, if he began monitoring her movements more closely or restricting her freedom further, the careful, patient approach she and Cassandra had been building might collapse entirely before they had gathered enough evidence to proceed. She wrote to Cassandra the following morning, using their established method of passing messages through Grace, explaining the near discovery and the growing danger of continuing their meetings at their usual pace. Cassandra's response arrived within 2 days, brief but decisive, suggesting they accelerate their timeline significantly, moving forward with confronting Margaret Whitfield directly within the coming week rather than continuing to gather additional evidence at their previous careful pace. "We have enough already," Cassandra's note read. "My letters from our engagement, your documentation from your marriage, and the pattern established through Charlotte's letters that you discovered. Adding proof of his current infidelity with Margaret Whitfield will complete the picture we need. We cannot risk waiting longer if his suspicion toward you is already growing. It is time to act, before he has the opportunity to discover what we have been building and take steps to protect himself from the consequences he has earned." Elena read the note twice, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something close to determination, understanding that the careful, patient phase of their plan was quickly drawing to a close. Whatever came next would require courage far beyond what documenting evidence in quiet secrecy had demanded of her thus far. It would require confronting Margaret Whitfield directly, gathering final proof of Alastair's ongoing infidelity, and ultimately preparing to expose everything they had learned in front of an audience capable of ensuring the truth could not simply be dismissed or explained away through Alastair's considerable charm and social influence. She thought as she folded Cassandra's note carefully and hid it alongside her other documentation beneath the loose floorboard, of the young woman who had once walked into the wrong hallway at Renwick Hall nearly 2 years earlier, naive and hopeful, believing she had found something rare and genuine in a duke's unexpected attention. That woman felt like a stranger to her now, someone she remembered with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow, someone who could never have imagined the path that innocent mistake would eventually lead her down. But that woman, Elena understood clearly now, had also possessed something valuable that the passing months of quiet cruelty had nearly extinguished entirely: a willingness to believe in the possibility of a better life, a stubborn hope that had somehow survived even the darkest moments of her marriage. It was that same hope, transformed now into something steadier and more determined, that would carry her through whatever difficult confrontations still waited ahead, whatever risks remained in finally exposing the truth about the man she had once believed she loved. Outside her window, the last traces of winter were finally beginning to give way to the first tentative signs of spring, and Elena, standing quietly in her chambers with the weight of everything she and Cassandra had built together settling firmly across her shoulders, allowed herself, for the first time in many months, to imagine a future entirely free from Renwick Hall and everything it had come to represent in her life. Cassandra arranged the meeting with Margaret Whitfield for a Thursday afternoon, choosing a time when her sources confirmed Alastair would be occupied with business obligations across the city, leaving no risk of an unexpected encounter that might complicate their careful plan. Margaret's small house sat at the edge of a quiet street, modest but well kept, with flowers planted carefully along the front walkway that suggested a woman who took genuine pride in the little she possessed. Alina had insisted on being present for this conversation herself, despite Cassandra's initial suggestion that she remain uninvolved to avoid any appearance of confrontation or jealousy. "This is different from what happened to me," Alina had explained during their final planning session at the tea house. "I want her to hear the truth from someone who has lived through exactly what she is likely experiencing right now. Someone who understands precisely how convincing his promises can feel before you learn what lies beneath them." Margaret answered her own door, a slender woman perhaps 10 years older than Alina, with kind eyes that immediately registered confusion at the sight of two unfamiliar women standing on her doorstep. Cassandra had prepared careful words for this moment, understanding that whatever they revealed in the next several minutes would likely shatter something important in this stranger's life, regardless of how gently they attempted to deliver the truth. "Mrs. Whitfield," Cassandra began, her voice calm and measured. "My name is Cassandra Thorne, and this is Alina, Duchess of Renwick. We apologize for arriving unannounced, but we believe there is something important you deserve to know, something that concerns a man you have likely been seeing regularly over these past several months." Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded, though she did not immediately close the door on them, some instinct apparently telling her that whatever these two women had come to say carried weight worth hearing, however unwelcome it might prove to be. "You had better come inside," she said finally, stepping back to allow them entry. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Alina and Cassandra explained, as gently as the difficult truth allowed, the full pattern of Alastair's behavior across multiple relationships spanning several years. They spoke of Charlotte's letters, discovered hidden away in the library, documenting warmth followed by cruelty followed eventually by desperate flight. They spoke of Cassandra's own 2 years of engagement, the isolation and control disguised initially as protective concern. Alina spoke of her own marriage, of the cold silences and careful diminishment that had transformed her from a hopeful young woman into someone who had learned to weigh every word before speaking in her own home. Margaret listened in increasingly stricken silence, her hands trembling slightly around a teacup she had prepared but never touched. And by the time Alina and Cassandra finished their account, tears stood clearly in her eyes, though she did not allow them to fall. "He told me he was unhappy in his marriage," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That his wife did not understand him, that their relationship had become an obligation rather than a genuine partnership. He said I was different, that I understood him in ways no one else ever had." "He told me almost exactly the same things about Cassandra," Alina said gently, reaching across to touch Margaret's hand briefly. "Word for word in some cases, though I did not fully understand that until recently. I believe, based on everything we have gathered, that this is simply how he begins each relationship, offering exactly the words each woman most needs to hear, until the initial pursuit is complete and something colder emerges underneath." Margaret sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what she had just learned, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a steadiness that suggested the shock was already beginning to transform into something closer to resolve. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "If you are gathering evidence of some kind, evidence to finally hold him accountable for this pattern, I want to help. I have letters he wrote me, and I can provide detailed accounts of our meetings, dates and locations that would confirm everything you have already gathered from other sources." Both Alina and Cassandra felt a wave of relief at Margaret's response, understanding that her willingness to participate would strengthen their case considerably, transforming what might have remained circumstantial suspicion into a documented pattern spanning multiple relationships and multiple years, impossible for Alastair to simply explain away or dismiss as isolated misunderstandings. Over the following days, the three women worked together with growing efficiency, combining their respective evidence into a comprehensive account that told, with devastating clarity, the true story of Alastair Renwick's character across nearly 5 years of relationships. Charlotte's letters provided the earliest documented pattern, revealing warmth transforming gradually into isolation and fear. Cassandra's own records from their 2-year engagement, along with several preserved letters in Alastair's own handwriting, demonstrated the same pattern repeating with painful consistency. Alina's careful documentation from her marriage added still further weight, chronicling specific incidents with dates and details that left little room for doubt regarding the deliberate, repeated nature of his behavior. And now Margaret's account of their ongoing relationship, conducted secretly throughout the entirety of Alina's marriage, provided undeniable proof that Alastair's cruelty and deception had continued unabated, regardless of the promises he had made to Alina during their courtship about building an honest life together. The question that remained, as their evidence grew increasingly comprehensive, was how best to reveal everything they had gathered in a manner that would ensure real consequences, rather than allowing Alastair's considerable social standing and practiced charm to somehow minimize or explain away the truth once it became public. "We need an audience he cannot control," Cassandra said during one of their planning sessions, now conducted at Margaret's modest home rather than the tea house, given the increasing sensitivity of their preparations. "Something public enough that he cannot simply dismiss us as bitter women seeking revenge, but structured carefully enough that we control the narrative rather than allowing him the opportunity to twist our evidence into something less damaging." Alina, thinking of the garden party that had first exposed her own relationship with Alastair so publicly and so painfully, found herself considering an idea that felt both fitting and slightly unsettling in its symmetry. "Lady Alina is hosting another gathering next month," she said slowly, the plan forming more clearly as she spoke it aloud. "A celebration marking the anniversary of Renwick Hall's founding, with most of the same society figures who witnessed the scandal at that garden party in attendance. If we present our evidence there, in front of the very people who once judged me so harshly without understanding the full truth of what they were witnessing, it would carry a symmetry that society would find difficult to ignore or dismiss." Cassandra considered this thoughtfully, understanding both the poetic justice of the location and the practical advantages it offered. Everyone who mattered would already be present, minimizing the effort required to assemble an appropriate audience, and the venue itself, being Renwick Hall, would make it impossible for Alastair to simply leave the confrontation and avoid the public reckoning they intended to deliver. "It could work," Cassandra said finally, "though we will need to be extraordinarily careful in how we present everything, ensuring the evidence speaks clearly for itself without giving him room to reframe the situation as simply bitter women seeking revenge against a man who chose to end relationships that no longer satisfied him." The 3 women spent the following weeks refining their plan with meticulous care, organizing their combined evidence into a clear, undeniable narrative, rehearsing exactly how they would present the truth to ensure maximum clarity and minimum opportunity for Alastair to deflect or minimize what they had gathered. Alina continued her careful performance of quiet compliance inside Renwick Hall, understanding that any hint of the plan taking shape outside its walls could unravel everything before they were ready to act. The tension of maintaining this dual existence, the outwardly diminished Duchess inside her marriage, and the increasingly determined architect of Alastair's public reckoning outside it, took a toll on Alina that she found herself struggling to fully conceal. There were moments late at night, when the fear of discovery pressed so heavily against her chest that she could barely breathe, moments when she questioned whether the entire plan might collapse under its own weight before they ever reached the anniversary celebration meant to expose everything. But there were other moments too, moments of quiet strength that surprised her with their steadiness, moments when she caught her own reflection in a mirror and recognized, beneath the careful mask of compliance she wore inside these walls, the same determined spirit that had once walked confidently into the wrong hallway of this very house, unafraid of a duke's unexpected attention. That spirit, she understood now, had never truly disappeared, only retreated temporarily beneath months of careful diminishment, waiting patiently for the right moment to reemerge fully and reclaim the life that had been slowly taken from her one small cruelty at a time. 10 days before the anniversary celebration, Alina received word through Grace that Alistair intended to travel briefly to inspect a property nearly 2 days' ride from Renwick Hall, business that would keep him away from the estate for the better part of a week. It was, both Alina and Cassandra quickly agreed, the perfect opportunity to finalize the last details of their plan without the constant fear of discovery that had shadowed every previous meeting. During those 7 days of Alistair's absence, Alina moved through Renwick Hall with a freedom she had not experienced since before her wedding, meeting openly with Cassandra and Margaret, reviewing their combined evidence one final time, ensuring every letter, every documented incident, every detail of their carefully constructed timeline remained accurate and ready for presentation. She even found, during those brief days of unexpected liberty, moments of genuine laughter shared with the two women who had become, against every expectation she might once have held, her closest allies and friends. "We should have been friends from the beginning," Cassandra observed one evening. The three women gathered around Margaret's small kitchen table, evidence spread carefully before them alongside cups of tea that had long since gone cold. "Instead of enemies pitted against each other by a man who never deserved either of our devotion. We are friends now," Alina said simply. "That is what matters most, regardless of how difficult the path was that brought us here." Margaret nodded in quiet agreement, and for a brief moment, sitting together in that small, warm kitchen, the three women allowed themselves to feel something closer to hope than fear, a growing certainty that whatever difficulties still waited ahead at Lady Alina's anniversary celebration, they would face them together, united by a shared truth that Alistair Renwick could no longer hope to hide or control. Alistair returned from his travels 3 days before the celebration, his mood notably lighter than it had been in recent months, apparently satisfied with whatever business arrangements he had secured during his absence. Alina greeted him with the same careful composure she had maintained throughout their marriage, giving no indication whatsoever of the storm quietly gathering just beyond his awareness, a reckoning that would arrive, within days, in the very halls he had always considered entirely his own to control. The evening of the anniversary celebration arrived with unusually clear skies, the kind of gentle spring weather that seemed almost deliberately chosen to mock the storm quietly building beneath the surface of what was meant to be a joyful gathering. Renwick Hall had been decorated elaborately for the occasion, lanterns strung through the gardens where the earlier scandal had first unfolded, tables arranged with careful precision to accommodate the considerable guest list Lady Alina had assembled to mark the estate's founding. Alina dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown of deep green that Alistair had once complimented during the earliest days of their marriage, a small detail that felt important to her somehow, a reminder that she intended to face this evening not as the diminished, careful woman she had learned to become inside these walls, but as someone reclaiming the confidence that had once drawn Alistair's attention in the first place, confidence he had spent months trying to extinguish. Cassandra and Margaret arrived separately, blending carefully into the assembled crowd of guests, their presence unremarkable to anyone who did not already understand the significance of what the evening held in store. Grace, loyal throughout every difficult month that had led to this moment, positioned herself near the entrance of the main hall, ready to signal the precise moment when Alistair would be gathered with the largest possible audience, ensuring their confrontation would carry the same public weight that had once been used to devastate Cassandra so completely. The signal came shortly after the evening's formal toasts had concluded, when Alistair stood near the center of the great hall, surrounded by business associates and family members, accepting congratulations on the estate's long history with the easy, practiced charm that had always served him so effectively in social settings. Alina felt her heart pounding as she made her way through the crowd toward him, Cassandra and Margaret following at a measured distance, each carrying carefully organized documents that represented months of painful gathering and careful preparation. "Alistair," Alina said, her voice carrying clearly enough to draw the attention of those standing nearby, though not yet loud enough to command the full room's notice. "There is something important that needs to be addressed tonight, in front of everyone gathered here to celebrate this family's legacy." His expression shifted immediately to confusion, then something closer to wariness as he noticed Cassandra and Margaret approaching from either side. An unlikely trio whose combined presence clearly struck him as significant even before he fully understood what was unfolding. "Alina," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning edge that had grown familiar to her over the past year. "Whatever this is, it is not the time or place." "I disagree," Alina said, her voice growing steadier and louder now, drawing further attention from the surrounding guests, several of whom began quieting their own conversations to observe the unfolding scene. "I believe this is exactly the time and place, given that everyone gathered here tonight witnessed the beginning of this story in this very garden, nearly 2 years ago." The reference was unmistakable, and Alina watched recognition dawn across the faces of several nearby guests who had indeed been present at that earlier scandalous confrontation. The crowd's attention shifted rapidly now, conversations dying away as more and more people turned to observe what was clearly becoming a significant moment, drawn by the same hunger for drama and revelation that had made the original garden party scandal such memorable gossip throughout the city. Cassandra stepped forward then, her composure remarkable given the weight of what she was about to reveal, and began speaking in a clear, steady voice that carried easily across the increasingly silent hall. "2 years ago, in this very garden, I stood before many of you and revealed that Alistair Renwick had been unfaithful to me during our engagement," Cassandra said. "What none of you knew then, and what I did not fully understand myself until recently, was that this was not an isolated moment of poor judgment on his part, but part of a deliberate and repeated pattern spanning years, one that has continued even after his marriage to the woman he claimed to love so completely that day." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging startled glances as they began to grasp the significance of what was unfolding before them. Alistair's face had gone pale, his earlier composure cracking visibly as he glanced desperately around the hall, searching perhaps for some avenue of escape or deflection that did not present itself readily. "This is a private family matter," he said sharply, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Whatever grievances these women believe they hold against me do not belong in front of this audience." "They belong exactly here," Alina said firmly, stepping forward to stand beside Cassandra, Margaret joining them a moment later to complete the trio that had once seemed impossible. 3 women united against the man who had once believed he could control each of them separately. "Because you chose this audience yourself, 2 years ago, when you decided a public garden was the appropriate place to end your engagement rather than a private conversation. We are simply following the precedent you established." Alina began speaking then, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her careful composure, describing the pattern of behavior she had documented throughout their marriage, the isolation, the cold silences, the careful diminishment disguised as concern for propriety and reputation. She spoke of finding Charlotte's letters hidden in the library, of learning that a woman had fled this very household years before Cassandra's engagement had even begun, driven away by the same coldness Alina herself had come to know intimately. Cassandra followed with her own account, describing the 2 years of her engagement with unflinching honesty, revealing details of isolation and control that painted a portrait entirely different from the composed, dignified woman society had watched walk away from that earlier confrontation with her head held high. Several guests gasped audibly as she described specific incidents, comments Alistair had made, restrictions he had imposed, patterns that mirrored precisely what Alina had just finished describing about her own marriage. Finally, Margaret stepped forward, her voice softer than the other 2 women's, but no less steady, revealing her own relationship with Alistair, conducted secretly throughout the entirety of his marriage to Alina, built on the same promises and warmth that had drawn each woman in before them, only to reveal the same underlying coldness once the initial pursuit had concluded successfully. The silence that followed Margaret's account was profound, the assembled crowd absorbing the full weight of what they had just witnessed. 3 women, each once believed to be rivals or strangers to one another, united by a shared and devastating truth about the man standing at the center of their celebration. "This is absurd," Alistair said finally, his voice rising with something between anger and desperation. "These women are clearly conspiring together out of jealousy and bitterness, inventing stories to destroy my reputation because they could not accept when our relationships concluded naturally." "We have evidence," Cassandra said calmly, gesturing to the documents she and the other women had carried into the hall. "Letters in your own handwriting, dated across multiple years, describing the same promises made to each of us in turn. Documented incidents with specific dates and witnesses who can confirm the patterns we have described. This is not simply the word of 3 bitter women, Alistair. This is a carefully documented history that speaks for itself, regardless of whatever explanation you attempt to offer tonight." The crowd's mood had shifted decisively now. Sympathy that had once belonged entirely to Cassandra during that earlier garden confrontation now extending across all 3 women, while the easy charm that had always protected Alistair from serious social consequence began crumbling visibly under the weight of evidence too specific and too consistent to easily dismiss. Several guests who had once whispered judgmentally about Alina's role in the original scandal now watched her with something closer to sympathy and respect, recognizing the courage required to stand publicly and reveal such painful truths about her own marriage. Lady Alina, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, appeared devastated by the unfolding revelation, understanding immediately the damage this evening would inflict on her nephew's reputation, and by extension, the family name she had spent years trying to protect and rebuild. But even she, watching the evidence presented with such careful, undeniable precision, could not summon words to defend Alistair against accusations that so clearly resonated as truth to everyone gathered in that hall. Alistair remained standing at the center of the room, surrounded now not by admiring guests eager to celebrate his family's legacy, but by an audience whose expressions had shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching disgust, as the full pattern of his behavior became undeniably clear. He opened his mouth several times to speak, to offer some defense or explanation that might salvage the evening, but no words emerged that carried enough conviction to counter what 3 women had just revealed with such careful, unified precision. "I want a divorce," Alina said finally, her voice cutting cleanly through the tense silence that had settled over the hall. "I will not spend one more day pretending to be your wife, while you continue this pattern with whatever woman comes next, believing herself to be different from those who came before her. I am done being controlled, isolated, and diminished by a man who never intended to offer any of the women in his life genuine honesty or lasting devotion." The words landed with the finality of a door closing, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, Alistair seemed to fully understand that whatever control he had maintained over Alina, over their marriage, over the careful public image he had spent years cultivating, had finally and completely collapsed beyond any hope of repair. He left the hall shortly afterward, pushing through the crowd of guests who no longer offered him the easy admiration he had grown accustomed to receiving, his departure marking not a dramatic conclusion to the evening's events, but simply the quiet, inevitable end of a story built on deception that had finally been exposed to the light it could no longer survive within. In the days following the anniversary celebration, the story of what had happened at Renwick Hall spread through the city with even greater speed than the original scandal 2 years earlier. This time, however, the narrative that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had once painted Alina as a home wrecker and Cassandra as a wronged but ultimately forgettable victim. Instead, newspapers and drawing-room conversations alike began referring to the courage of 3 women who had come together despite every reason to remain divided, exposing a pattern of cruelty that had been allowed to continue unchecked for years simply because no single account, on its own, had carried enough weight to overcome Alastair's considerable charm and social standing. Alastair himself retreated from public life almost entirely in the weeks that followed, his business associates growing increasingly hesitant to maintain relationships that now carried significant reputational risk, his remaining family members distancing themselves publicly to protect what remained of their own standing within society. The financial troubles his father had left behind, troubles that had originally driven him toward an arranged marriage with Cassandra in the first place, resurfaced with renewed urgency now that his reputation could no longer smooth over the difficult negotiations required to manage the estate's ongoing debts. Alina filed for divorce within a week of the confrontation, her legal position strengthened considerably by the extensive documentation she and the other women had gathered, evidence that made any attempt by Alastair to contest the proceedings both difficult and, given the public nature of the revelations, largely pointless. The process took several months to fully conclude, but by early summer, Alina found herself formally released from a marriage that had cost her nearly 2 years of her life, and a version of herself she had needed considerable time and support to fully recover. She did not return to her old life as a seamstress, though she maintained genuine fondness for the craft that had first brought her into Alastair's orbit all those years earlier. Instead, using a modest settlement secured through the divorce proceedings, along with skills she had quietly developed while managing various aspects of Renwick Hall during her marriage, Alina opened a small shop of her own, employing several young women who reminded her, in various ways, of the hopeful, uncertain girl she had once been herself, walking into the wrong hallway of a grand estate with no idea how completely that mistake would reshape her entire life. Cassandra, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly embraced by society, in ways she had never anticipated following the original scandal that had once driven her family into isolation. The courage she had displayed in coming forward a second time, in setting aside personal humiliation to protect other women from a pattern of behavior she understood better than almost anyone, earned her a respect that proved far more valuable and lasting than the arranged marriage that had originally been intended to secure her family's financial future. Within a year, her family's fortunes had improved considerably, not through marriage or inheritance, but through Cassandra's own careful management of what remained of their assets, guided by lessons she had learned, painfully, but thoroughly, during her engagement to a man who had once made her feel entirely powerless. Margaret Whitfield, the widow whose brief relationship with Alastair had ultimately provided crucial evidence in exposing his true character, returned to her quiet life with a newfound clarity about the kind of genuine partnership she hoped to find eventually, rather than settling for the false warmth that had initially drawn her toward Alastair's attention. She remained close friends with both Alina and Cassandra long after the events at Renwick Hall had faded from the city's collective memory, the three women maintaining a friendship built on shared understanding that few others could fully comprehend. Grace, whose careful loyalty had proven so essential throughout the entire process, found herself offered a position at Alina's new shop shortly after the divorce concluded, gladly leaving behind the tense atmosphere that had continued to pervade Renwick Hall under Alastair's diminished but still difficult presence. She often remarked, during quiet moments at the shop, how strange it felt to work alongside the same woman she had once served as Duchess, though Alina always insisted that their roles had never truly been so different as the titles suggested, that friendship and loyalty had always mattered more between them than the formal distance their previous positions had implied. As for Alastair, the years following the confrontation at his family's anniversary celebration brought a slow, steady decline in both his social standing and financial security. Without the reputation that had once allowed him to smooth over difficult business negotiations and secure advantageous arrangements through charm alone, he found himself increasingly unable to manage the debts his father had originally left behind, debts that had driven him toward manipulation and deception in the first place. Renwick Hall itself, was eventually sold to settle outstanding obligations. The grand estate that had once represented his family's centuries-old legacy, passing into the hands of a wealthy merchant family, with no connection to the scandal that had unfolded within its walls. Alina learned of the estate's sale nearly 2 years after her divorce had concluded, reading the brief mention in a newspaper while sitting in the small, comfortable office above her thriving shop. She felt no particular satisfaction in the news, no lingering desire for further vindication or revenge against the man who had once controlled so much of her life. Instead, she felt only a quiet sense of closure, an understanding that the story which had once seemed capable of destroying her entirely had finally reached a conclusion that allowed her to move forward without the weight of unresolved anger still shadowing her days. She thought occasionally of that first meeting in the wrong hallway of Renwick Hall, of the young woman who had smiled back at a duke's easy charm, without understanding the price that smile would eventually demand of her. She did not regret the experience entirely, understanding that it had ultimately led her not only through profound pain and difficulty, but also toward genuine friendships with Cassandra and Margaret that she treasured deeply, toward a business of her own that gave her purpose and independence she had never fully imagined possible during her earlier years as an anonymous seamstress working under someone else's direction. The scars remained, in quieter moments, memories of cold silences and careful diminishment that occasionally resurfaced unexpectedly, reminding her of lessons learned at considerable personal cost. But alongside those difficult memories, Alina carried something equally powerful, a clear understanding of her own strength, tested and proven through months of careful documentation and eventual courage, a strength she suspected she might never have fully discovered had her path never crossed with Alastair Renwick's at all. On a warm afternoon nearly 3 years after the confrontation that had finally exposed his true character to the world, Alina sat in the garden behind her shop, sharing tea with Cassandra and Margaret, the 3 women laughing together over some small, ordinary joke that had nothing whatsoever to do with the painful history that had first brought them together. Grace moved through the shop below, managing customers with the same quiet efficiency she had once brought to her duties at Renwick Hall, and Alina, watching her friends laugh in the gentle sunlight, felt a contentment she had once believed impossible to reclaim after everything she had endured. She thought of the young man who had once found her in the wrong hallway, who had offered warmth and charm that had ultimately proven hollow beneath its polished surface, and she felt, for the first time in years, no anger toward him whatsoever, only a distant, faded sadness for the woman she had once been, so eager to believe in a love that had never truly existed the way she needed it to. That woman had survived, had grown, had ultimately found her way toward something far more valuable than the title and status Alastair had once offered her. A genuine community of women who understood exactly what she had endured and had helped carry her through it toward something better on the other side. The story that had begun with scandal and heartbreak in a rain-soaked greenhouse, that had unfolded through humiliation in a public garden, and endured through months of quiet cruelty behind Renwick Hall's carefully maintained walls, had finally concluded not with revenge or bitterness, but with something far more meaningful: 3 women who had once been strangers or rivals, now bound together by friendship, resilience, and the hard-won understanding that genuine strength often emerges most powerfully not despite pain, but through the courage required to finally name it, document it, and refuse to let it continue silently harming those who might otherwise have followed the very same painful path. Alina Voss had once believed she had stolen a duke away from the woman meant to marry him. She understood now, looking back across everything that had happened since that fateful morning she wandered into the wrong hallway, that she had stolen nothing at all. She had simply been offered, briefly and deceptively, something Alastair Renwick had never truly possessed the capacity to give genuinely to anyone, and in losing that illusion, she had ultimately found something real and lasting instead, built not on a man's fleeting attention, but on her own resilience and the genuine friendship of women who understood, better than anyone else could, exactly what she had survived to finally reach this quiet, contented afternoon in the sunlit garden behind the shop she had built entirely for herself.